Okay. Hello everyone and welcome back to the Procurement and Finance Coffee Break. Today we have a special guest, Harry Briggs, who is an expert in ESG and Sustainability Reporting from Terra Instinct. Now Harry, before we delve into the critical aspects of ESG and Sustainability Reporting, and understand what the impact is for CFOs and CPOs, which we're particularly interested in. I think it'd be really interesting to share with the viewers a little bit about the three companies you've formed: Terra Instinct, Terra Real Estate and Terra Exchange, and I think they're all about 18 months old. Yep. Why you left the Big Four and why did you found these companies? What was the gap and the passion you have behind these three companies?
So firstly, thanks for having me. Great to be here. So I guess a bit of background to me. So I was a Director of Sustainability at one of the Big Four. I was doing a lot of work with financial institutions, advising in, and I managed to do a secondment for a year with Accounting for Sustainability, which is a fantastic NGO that works with multinationals, diving deep into sustainability reporting and the challenges around that. So why did I leave the Big Four and set this up? I realised that you need a slightly different skill set if you want to get really stuck into these issues. So Big Four, there's a sort of very heavy on accounting and regulation, which is definitely an important part of it. But I needed scientists, engineers, these kind of skill sets as well. And what I wanted to do was get really into the data, really into the detail, and then you bring that up, and the corporate reporting piece is kind of the final element to it, really. And these different companies do slightly different things. So we do a lot of work with financial institutions, funds and corporates at Terra Instinct, where we help bridge that gap with compliance if they have to do various reporting under new regulations. This kind of technical work here, which is more of an accounting skill set nowadays. And then Terra Real Estate, we've brought in energy engineers and nature-based expertise. So that's working at real estate asset level. So that's saying, really individually, this is what needs to change in this building if we want to get it to net zero. So heat pumps, this kind of thing, insulation. It's a completely different skill set, which is why we boxed it in that. Okay. The exchange is another beast altogether as well. So there's a new compliance market for nature offsets in the UK, and it's called Biodiversity Net Gain. So the exchange is a trading platform for biodiversity net gain. Again, deep into the skill sets there, but it's very nature heavy. It's very much sort of looking at technical metrics that
is the exchange like a carbon offset, or am I not
very similar, very similar.
Okay.
Very similar, but for nature.
Okay. So Terra Instinct, more about the accounting and the data, and perhaps going a level below what Big Four do to be able to actually pull all the data together to be able to report.
Exactly, yeah, so I suppose that's the difference. We'll actually do reporting for clients, whereas in a Big Four environment you would advise clients how to do the reporting themselves. Yes,
and then they may struggle to do it themselves. Okay, interesting. So over to you, Richard.
I know you can tell the look. I mean, do you know what? We did, I think it was our second or third coffee break.
Right.
Talking about emerging ESG legislation and about ISSB, just because it's nice to have someone who actually genuinely knows what they're talking about, rather than Richard and Claire having a random discussion over coffee. I mean, if you were just going to give a quick overview to the CFO and the CPO community about the legislation that's either here or coming down the tracks and the reporting burden that comes with it. I mean, what would your headlines be?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot that's already come in, and there's a lot more coming. So globally, one of the most significant developments in the last couple of years is the ISSB, which is probably covered in that coffee break episode. So this is the IFRS accounting body writing sustainability standards. So we'd expect in the UK, the FCA are probably going to consult on making those mandatory at the end of 2024.
Right, that's soon.
That's soon, because there's already a reporting requirement in place for TCFD, which is climate only, ISSB a bit broader. So we'd expect that to be happening. So that's, if you're in scope from the FCA point of view, so listed companies, large asset managers, financial institutions, that's definitely one thing that's coming down the line, although you're probably already doing TCFD. From a procurement perspective, so there are differing rules coming through, and there's a lot of regulation in Europe that's going to impact a lot of companies as well, really focusing on supply chains.
Yep.
And not just climate, we're talking about human rights a lot in the supply chain, how you get comfortable with that. So that's a huge area of supply chain due diligence. And then more broadly, a lot of these regulations and regimes are pushing you to do that more holistic risk assessment. So climate risk, nature risk, social risks, all the way through your business, your supply chain, what happens to products after they leave you as well.
Right.
So it's only going up, unfortunately.
Only because I always like to slip in an extra question. I mean, I'm always intrigued by, particularly when you're talking about something like environmental improvement and human rights protection, where I could go to anybody in the street and say, do you think they're a good thing? And the majority of people will say, yes, they're a good thing. But that's not necessarily what drives companies to do stuff. What's your perception of how much of this are companies adopting this because of the push of legislation and the fear of the penalty if you don't, versus the sort of consumer ethic pull of companies doing the right thing? Where's your sense of the balance?
I think it's sector dependent. I think if you're, particularly if you're in retail and you're quite exposed to reputational risk, then I think you've been alert to this, and if you know you've got supply chains that are vulnerable, they're running through countries with poor records, etc. Yeah. Or even countries with poor data, even though they don't have a poor record, there's just lack of visibility. That's on your risk register.
Some of the fast fashion being in the news a lot with having their clothes produced in sweatshops and the like.
It's a really good example, and we're actually just in talks to do some work on supply chain for not necessarily fast fashion, but a fashion outlet where the visibility through the supply chain is just really difficult. You can go one layer, maybe 2 layers down, but beyond that, where's that cotton coming from? It's really difficult. So they've definitely been early adopters on a voluntary basis. But I think that pressure coming through from consumers is what's driving the regulation, which is what's driving the rest of the
that's the cycle.
Yeah.
Thank you. Interesting.
Okay, so then if we think about finance, how can CFOs integrate ESG considerations when they're thinking about how they plan and manage their finance function? And myself, from a finance transformation point of view, I'm particularly thinking about how they plan to transform their finance function, because I guess you could come up with all sorts of plans to implement ERP systems or make changes in business processes, but if you do that without thinking what current and future ESG and sustainability reporting and potentially like triple bottom line, you mentioned people, requirements are now and what they're likely to be in the future, when you put that plan together, it might be a bit short-sighted. You might have to rethink how you've implemented something.
Yeah, so I mean, this is a really interesting area, and this is very much the mandate of the NGO that I mentioned, Accounting for Sustainability. So they've got loads of great free resources on their website about it, how you integrate ESG into decision making. So I suppose strategically it's got to start with what we call a materiality assessment. So what really matters to me and my business from an ESG perspective? So what impacts do we as a business have directly, and what impacts us? And you can think about that financially, but also more broadly your impact on community and communities in your supply chain. Once you've identified what those impacts are, you feel like you've got your short list of metrics then it's about, okay, well, how do we get the data for those metrics so that we can incorporate that into decision making? Now that might be risk as well, so you might be looking at how you incorporate climate risk or nature risk into the decision making. It might also be about how do we map this with our broader strategic objectives to decarbonise or go nature positive or whatever it might be. And that's where you get into the complexity of your world, which is all about finance transformation, how we get the right systems in place to capture that data. And what we tend to find is sort of 80% of the data you need exists in the business somewhere. It's just not being captured. and often it's sat on the same invoice that you're picking the amount out for your bookkeepers to put into the accounting system, but you need to pick up the other piece as well. Like energy bills are a good example.
And I suppose if you think about an ERP implementation, one of the key things when you do that is designing your data model. But let's say from a finance perspective, you come up with your data model, you've decided what your global chart of accounts looks like, what dimensions you want, what cost centres. It could be that some of those data dimensions that you want for ESG reporting, perhaps you don't want them in your general ledger. Perhaps you want a thin ledger, maybe you want them in some other repository like some sort of data warehouse, because there is a sort of, a growing thought that you should try and keep your general ledger and what's in the ledger like fairly slim and for financial reporting purposes, and then all sorts of other data that you perhaps want for internal KPIs, for operations, sales, ESG, perhaps that's in a broader data warehouse that's but somehow captured by the end-to-end business processes that you implement.
And the only thing I'd add to that is if you're doing that, you need to carry over the disciplines you have in the financial data capture, because the trend and direction of travel for all of this is that you're going to be doing sustainability reporting that gets audited.
Yeah.
And certainly in the EU, they're bringing in regulation that requires reporting for 50,000 companies and requires audits on it.
Yeah.
So you still need that control process piece around the data.
So I guess what you're saying is, for financial reporting, when we key in an invoice or raise a PO, we'll have to make sure that we meet those disclosure requirements in a good ERP implementation. We will make sure that those dimensions are captured as mandatory, so that the ERP system can spit out disclosure notes that go with your financial reporting. Now, if you haven't got a good ERP system, you might have to pull together some of those disclosure notes. But to Harry's point there, you were talking about having the same mandated capturing of information, because otherwise, you could end up only having half the data you need in your lovely new system you've implemented.
Exactly.
I'm sort of sat here listening, right, and I've got my CPA hat on, and I think it would be pretty reasonable that the majority of CPOs would see a ton of a mountain of challenge coming their way. Right? So if I'm looking at supply chains, I'm looking at CFRD coming out of Europe, German supply chain Lieferkettengesetze. I've got Norwegian slavery. I've got French protection. I've got UK modern slavery. I mean, I've got all this stuff. I've got to keep up with it. What are the requirements? Secondly, many of them now require me to go allegedly to tier N. And I'm looking all the way down my supply chain and thinking, do you know what? Just keeping on top of invoices and cost is challenge number one. And now, across the spectrum of ESG and human rights, including Scope 3, I've now got all of these things that I'm supposed to be engaging with my suppliers and gathering data. And I think it would be a pretty human reaction from most CPOs to go, how? I mean, how? From your perspective, if you were going to, talk to a group of CPOs who are looking at this and saying, I don't even know what I've got to do, let alone how I'm going to do it. What would be your key advice as to how to approach suppliers and the supply chain to start making this possible? Because looking at it right now, this is a cliff for a lot of businesses, right?
So I think two key things that will help. One is technology.
Right.
And there's a lot of technology offerings that are gathering data on supply chain that can be your friend in this, and they've done assessments of various companies through the process, so you can leverage that. And two is joint action. So you're one customer of that supplier. There are a lot of other customers that are under similar pressures to you. and use your industry bodies to approach it.
Right.
And that's been happening quite well in certain sectors we work in. So solar is a good example. There was a real issue a few years ago where it transpired a lot of forced labour was being used. Exactly. In the quartz mining that goes into them. So they've taken joint action, and the suppliers serving them who are in China are very accommodating of those requirements, and they are allowing audits to go and trace, sort of raw materials in the mine, so that these people are comfortable they're buying clean panels.
Right.
But that's a good example of where any one player in that market, they wouldn't have that.
Wouldn't have a chance.
No, absolutely. So you've got to use those international bodies as well as just sort of local bodies, because obviously they're serving all of Europe and America from these companies. That's
good.
Interesting.
Thank you.
And then thinking about ESG reporting for smaller and non-listed companies, I'm sure many of our viewers come from smaller and mid-cap companies. Perhaps ESG processes are a little bit mature in listed companies, or they're more aware of the regulatory requirements. What do you think are the main points to be aware of in terms of expectations and benefits for ESG reporting for non-listed companies, or companies are just outside the scope of current regulations?
Yeah, I think that last point's the first key piece, which is that most of the regulations coming in do take account of company size. So the good news is you're probably going to be out of scope for a lot of the stuff. What you need to be aware of is that those regulations exist and they're hitting your customers, your investors, so you're going to get an impact of that downstream, because all of this stuff looks through supply chains. So if it's your business selling to a bigger business, you're going to get asked questions about your emissions and things like that. So you don't necessarily have to go the whole hog and do full compliant reporting and disclosure, but certain key information is going to be really valuable to your customers, and you can really make their life easier if you're able to provide it. And definitely if you go up to those sort of listed companies, the pain points is always getting information out of suppliers. So if you set yourself up and you can give them the data they need, they're going to like you from a procurement perspective as well. That's a big box to tick. So I'd focus more on the data, and you don't have to worry as much about the regulatory compliance and the full disclosures and the reporting standards and all that. But get a grip of your data for sure.
Yeah. Okay.
So I'm going to take that kind of pragmatic view, which is no matter how much someone tries to sell it to me, the thought of yet more reporting on yet more legislation with yet more penalties. I mean, it's forehead hits the table time in terms of, many will just see this as work. What's the silver lining to the cloud? I mean, if companies embrace this and they focus on, as you say, whether it's tech or training or joint action, what do you think are the potential benefits? Not just that procurement and finance teams might see, but business as a whole might see, if they just accept it, roll forward through what will undoubtedly be an initial shock of extra work. But what do you think's there on the other side that's going to make this worthwhile?
Well, step back and why we're doing it all. Like ultimately, we're trying to get to net zero, save the planet. Human rights is a good thing. So there's a genuine purpose behind this. It's not a mindless regulation like sometimes they seem. There is a genuine reason. Then use that, right? So everyone struggles with staff engagement in the business. This is one area where actually you can really engage the workforce, because everyone is sort of pro reducing emissions. Everyone's pro cutting out human rights abuse in the supply chain. So engage your staff through this. You're going to get the job done. You're going to have to get it done because it's regulation or it's a customer demand. So just turn it into an opportunity. Be proactive about it. And then the third thing is market that. You can really differentiate at the moment. If you're on top of all of this, that will set you apart in the market that you're in. So turn it into a marketing piece as well. So you've got a lot of opportunities coming from what might seem like a mundane compliance exercise. You're going to have to do it anyway, so you may as well do it and take advantage of it. And ultimately, if we all do it, then hopefully we get to net zero.
Kind of cool.
And I guess another benefit is, it's another catalyst for re-engineering your business processes and looking at your data, which to the other vlogs we've done, we're always going on about how a good data model and good integrated systems are key to be able to measure business performance. So if you consider it also not just for saving the planet, but as a catalyst for actually thinking about your business processes and thinking about how you improve business performance whilst looking at this.
Well, a perfect example, I was working with a client just before Christmas. They have got big cost reduction targets, every company's got them. They've also got reduced CO2 emissions by 50%. So they've put in place their scope 3 reporting, they're doing it. When you actually upload the surface end, the procurement team, when they're doing their RFPs and they're doing their cost analysis of different vendor options, they're not looking at CO2. So how are you going to hit a target if if your procurement team isn't also asking, right, what's the cost of the product? What's the CO2 of the product? Because if it doesn't help us reduce, I can't. It doesn't matter how cheap it is. It's actually it's going to cause me a problem. So I think you're right. I think that re-engineering that whole way of thinking about what you're doing. That, as you say, reporting isn't about a burden. It's about helping you to do the right thing, which could be very positive for staff and actually a source of great competitive advantage for your business.
Yeah, absolutely.
Great.
Thank you.
Well, thank you, Harry, for sharing your expertise with us today. It's been a really valuable discussion, especially how CFOs and CPOs can navigate the ESG and sustainability landscape, and also about thinking about the topic we discussed on before, the triple bottom line effect on businesses going forwards. And thanks to our viewers for joining us again today. Stay tuned for some more insights into the world of procurement and finance.
Bravo.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.